It is very interesting how the land was divided into separate farms long ago. As I've said before, the boundaries were almost completely stone wall fences. Our farm was mainly cleared, tillable parcels of land with a great many acres of woodland. We were bordered by at least 4, maybe 5 different farms. Just how these owners originally decided on these borders, I'll never know. On one side, a long length, was the Ditko farm. On the opposite side of us, we were wedged in between, was the Chayinsky place. Since our farm was longer than the Chayinsky farm, we continued far into the woods, and there we were bordered by the Morgan place, then still further by another farm and another. It may have been the Tibbetts farm, and I don't know who else. So you see, there were many fences to check on and to repair, or our cattle would wander and be lost very far from home. If they wandered away, they might even wind up in another town along the town road. Then we would have to search for them. That is why many of the cows had bells around their necks so that we could hear them. Deep in the woods, in some places, heavy wood log fences separated properties together with stone walls. Because some of the cattle were good jumpers or very daring, they would break the fences down. And sometimes a cow, ready to deliver her baby, would seek refuge far in the woods in a quiet glen. That cow always had a bell. It was not unusual for my father and the older boys to take a lantern at night and go into the woods in search of the animal, sometimes bringing the baby home in their arms because it was too young to walk the distance. The Chayinsky farm had much less woodland than ours, but it did have acres and acres and acres of wild blueberries just loaded with them. It was heaven to the blueberry pickers, and many people sneaked in to pick them. There were blue blueberries, black blueberries, and what we called white blueberries with little pink cheeks on them. They differed only in color, the white being very rare and sparse, and we knew just where to find them. Sometimes our pies were made of a combination of berries, black, blue, and the white. When my mother wanted to make pies, she would send us out with a pail or a large pitcher to pick the berries while she was making the pie crust. The pies certainly were made of freshly picked berries, and did they taste good. Many times we had a blueberry pie for supper or lunch, and that was our meal. Of course, since we had very few berry bushes on our fields, we always sneaked over the fence to Chayinsky's property and picked to our heart's content. Many times we were chased out, but that didn't stop us. There were enough berries there for the birds and anyone else who wanted to pick them. After all, our house was closer to the berry-bearing land than the house belonging to the Chayinsky family. We could sneak in and out without being seen. And not only did my mother preserve the berries for winter, but we picked them also to sell in the city. My father went to the city, usually Norwich. In fact, that's the city he shopped at least once every week to sell farm produce and get whatever staples we needed. Staples that we could not raise on the farm, such as sugar or white flour and other things. Almost everything was raised on the farm, and being that my mother was such a capable preserver of fruits and vegetables, we had a great variety of food supplies for winter. I must tell you that we, children, knew just where the biggest and nicest blueberry bushes were. We always took note of the green ones and knew when to expect them to ripen. They all did not ripen at the same time. Some varieties ripened earlier and some later. They started ripening around the first part of July and continued through the middle of August. The latter were the large, late berries. In the swampier places, there were only the large, late ripening varieties. We even went to Garner's Lake to pick the swamp berries there. Some days we came home with as many as 30 or 40 quarts of berries, which we picked there in just one day. We walked several miles to pick them, taking lunches with us, also prepared to swim and do a little cavorting around in the water. My dad was always pleased with these berries because they were large and juicy, yet very firm, and he could sell them in Norwich whenever we had them. He had customers for them, customers who had ordered a number of quarts the previous trip or week. Then money was scarce then, so we had to do what we possibly could to make some money. No one was wealthy around us then. Everyone had to scheme how to raise money. The kids needed shoes and clothes and things were needed for the farm, just as families need an income nowadays. When my father went to Norwich, he took the market wagon loaded with different farm provisions. There was rarely a problem, but when he had berries, someone had to be in the wagon at all times to watch them. Otherwise, the kids in the street would climb into the wagon and steal them by handfuls, also squashing what they didn't take. At those times, one of those went with him as a sentinel on guard. It wasn't that simple because some of the kids in the street were very bold and would come to the wagon and say, "Ah, gee whiz, can't you give me some to eat? Just a handful." Sometimes, if I were the guardian, I'd be terrified and impatient for my dad to come out of the buyer's house and rescue the situation. However, we loved going into town with him, even though it always was a whole day trip, starting at dawn and coming home at dusk. The distance we traveled was about 10 miles or so. By the way, the market wagon was just that, a market wagon, or a wagon going to market. It could be likened to a little open truck with one double seat for the driver and a passenger. Since we picked berries in many different places, we had many different experiences. Whether the farmers would not or could not use them all themselves, they still chased intruders out. They knew they couldn't keep everyone out, but they tried, sometimes successfully, but mostly they didn't even know that we were there. We sneaked in, kept as quiet as we could, filled our containers, and went home. One time we went across Chayinsky's farm, onto Morgan's farm, and then onto the Palmer place. Neither of these two latter places had many berries, but they had some of the later varieties. As we climbed over the fence into Morgan's farm, we heard a rustle in the bushes. As we turned around to see what it was, there, close by, in front of us, his eyes flashing, his nose snorting, his front feet pawing the ground, ready to go after us, was a big bull. We didn't wait for the attack. We just turned tail and ran back over the fence. I think, if I remember correctly, we even dropped our pails. Well, that bull was ready to gore us, and we weren't about to let him. We barely made it over the fence as he was right in back of us. Wow, what a frightful experience. But you know, that didn't stop us. We went back again, but very seldom to that old place, because they didn't have good berries anyhow. Another time, my brother Bruno, my sister Estelle, and I were picking berries across our field in Chayinski's farm. We saw a big bush with gorgeous berries, huge blueberries, such big bunches. All the other berries around this one bush were picked clean, and we thought, how come this beautiful bush, we must have those berries. And we proceeded toward it, ready to begin picking, paying no attention to anything except getting at those berries. As we pulled down a branch or two to pick, we realized why this bush was neglected by pickers. The buzzing started. Hundreds of yellow jackets came out at us from the inside. How we ran! How we ran! Of course, we did get a few stings, and we left the berries on that bush for the birds and the bees. Another time, my sister Stella and I went picking on the low bushes. They were only about 2 feet tall, so we had to stoop to pick them. These were not huckleberries, which are very, very seedy. These were just wild, low bush blueberries. We had to kneel or squat down to pick them. My sister was a little further away from me. Within a few feet, or within a few minutes, I should say, after I squatted down to pick the berries, when I started to itch, I scratched a little, then a little more, then a little more. Then I became concerned and stood up. You know, I was already teaching school then, so you see I wasn't a kid. I was perhaps 20 or 21 years old. To my horror, I was squatting on an anthill, and my body was covered with ants. You never saw anyone undressing completely in the woods while running, as I did, away from that anthill. I had to clear all my clothes of the ants before I got dressed again. My sister and I laughed over it later, but it was no joke at the time. Incidentally, this sister of mine passed away at the age of 20 from peritonitis. She was 4 years younger than I. I'll go back again now to being a kid picking berries at Gardner's Lake. The lake was at least 1.5 miles away from our house, so we walked carrying our empty pails with us. All the bushes there were very tall, and they grew on clumps of grass and dirt, with swampy, muddy water surrounding each of them, or a few of them growing close together. They were like little islands. Sometimes the water was quite gone between these little clumps, especially during dry seasons. But always it was very, very damp and muddy. Most of the times we wore boots, but many times we were barefooted. We didn't seem to mind that because the bunches of berries were almost like bunches of grapes. They were beautiful. We came to the lake, then walked along what was then called Sandy Beach, and then we had to wade through a brook called Sucker Brook, which was often infested with bloodsuckers. We ran through it to get to the other side and try not to get bitten by one, because then that little sucker would lengthen as it filled with blood before it dropped off. I think we even pulled them off. Even as we hopped from one clump to another, we would sometimes fall into the mud and pick up a sucker from the mud. Now, on the other side of the brook, again, was a beach we called Pebble Beach, with nice water for swimming and bathing. This part of the shore was called Ray Shore. Now, where the berries grew, there was a great swamp, and when the lake filled, there was no shore there because the lake filled right into the swamp. We must have picked hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of quarts of berries there during the course of a few years. I don't think I went picking berries there beyond age 13 or 14. I may add here that several times my brothers rented a boat for $1 a day on the opposite shore of the lake and rowed across to Ray Shore, where the rest of us were waiting with our empty pails. Then we didn't have to wade through that sucker brook with water up to our waists. We enjoyed the rowing and cavorting around after we filled our pails. One year, my mother failed to preserve the berries when they were plentiful. My brother Bill and Bruno, maybe even Joe, went to the lake to pick berries for her and came home with empty containers. There were no berries to be had, so they said. My sister Stella and I said we would go to the lake shore and get some. So we went. We picked about 1 1/2 quarts. How we did it, I don't even know. I don't know how we even got 1 1/2 quarts. I think we must have picked every last berry that was there. We put our wet bathing clothes into the 10-quart pail, then covered them with the few berries that we had picked. It was our joke, and we laughed most heartily at our supposed 10-quart pail full of berries. The boys couldn't get over it. How could we pick 10 quarts when they couldn't get any? My mother said to them, "See, the girls could do it and you couldn't. You should be ashamed of yourselves." We started to laugh, and we laughed, and we laughed. By that time, the boys caught wise. "Hey, let's see those berries you picked," they cried. Stella and I ran away laughing. Our joke was out, and we had to run for it. I must have been around 13 or 14 then, and she was about 9 or 10. That year we had very little preserved berries for winter. My mother scolded us, but she laughed with us for our ingenuity to fool the boys.